This is an audio presentation of the book written by my great-grandfather, Marvin Darrell Stringfellow, entitled Winter Range. The book is about an adventure Grandpa had in 1913, taking his herd of sheep out into the western desert of central Utah at the end of winter. He was 20 years old at the time. He describes many landmarks, people he met along the trail, dangers he met along the way, and even a barroom brawl that my Uncle Wayne Stringfellow, Marvin's grandson, obtained an edited copy typed by my grandpa, Marvin Darrell Stringfellow, known as Darrell, and made a copy for me. Through the years, my copy has traveled across the country and is showing somewhere, so I'm making this audio copy for future generations to enjoy. The reading will be done verbatim, without any changes in grammar or names. In the story, Great-Grandpa mentions Aunt May. Aunt May was really known to her customers as Aunt Mary and was known as the Queen of the Range. A former saloon girl living with her common-law husband, she was a self-appointed nurse, helper, thirst quencher, stagecoach arranger, communicator, comforter, and the last resident of Joy, Utah. Aunt May's name was really Mary Laird, married eventually to Anthon Laird, and known by everyone as Aunt Mary. She was also known as No-Nose Maggie, due to a nose injury caused by a hurled liquor bottle. Apparently, Great-Grandpa's calling of Aunt May can be evidence that he didn't have as much dealing with her and her boarding house/saloon as the other herders in the area. I'm grateful that Great-Grandpa Stringfellow lived long enough for us to spend time with each other, long enough for me to learn about what a nice man he was. Thank you for listening to this presentation of Winter Range by Marvin Darrell Stringfellow. I hope you enjoy the presentation. From my heart to yours. Preface. George Stringfellow, father to Earl, George, Eldon, and Marvin, was a sheep rancher in the early days with his farm and home located in south part of Draper, Utah, and summer permit for his sheep in the low pass area of Currant Creek. Grandpa Stringfellow died in the year 1900 at the young age of 40, leaving 4 boys and 3 girls for Grandma Stringfellow to raise and property to worry about, as the oldest boy, Earl, must have been about 14. As I understand it, J.R. Allen, a neighbor and purebred sheep operator, stepped in to help Grandma dispose of the property burdens and build a house, barns, and chicken coops near the center of town. Important, too, was his giving the boys jobs as they became old enough to work. Here was formed their love for that out of doors, and particularly the sheep business. At the time this story takes place, there were lots of sheep on the range, and it was a profitable business. Western Utah, the winter range was wide open to all herds, and they could range where they wanted, no permits necessary. Grandpa Stringfellow was given a message to return a phone call on the only phone in Draper when he suffered a stroke on the front porch of the Rideout Mercantile. He lived a few days, paralyzed and angry, that he had so much to do and no chance to do it. And I'm assuming that this preface was written by my Grandpa Darrell, based on who he's referring to. Okay, now the book begins. Winter Range. It was January 13th, 1913, and my brother George and I were riding out on a heavily loaded supply wagon drawn by 3 horses. We had been on the road from Draper, Utah for 5 days, and were on our way to catch our other brothers, Eldon and Earl, who were with our sheep outfit. George and I had been home for Christmas and were returning across the desert winter range of western Utah with its valleys of sage and shad scale between series of block fault mountains. We were following the same route that we had followed about 4 weeks earlier as we trailed our winter herds before mixing them so some of us could go home for Christmas. I had been working with the sheep since August 13th, when I got word that I was needed since Earl and Eldon wanted to go to Kansas City with our lambs for market. The summer had been great. I had been given a job by the Draper Road supervisor so I could play baseball with the team that he managed. I took my baseball seriously and took great pride in my game. To break the monotony, we would on occasion take the shotgun and hunt rabbits near the road while the others would ride the wagon and keep the horses from being too lazy. Our trail across the desert had taken us past many landmarks familiar to the sheepmen of old and the rockhounds of today. We had crossed Cedar Valley, 5 Mile Pass, Rush Valley, Faust Station, the Crow Ranch, Lookout Mountain, Government Creek, the James Ranch, Riverbed, Table Mountain, Slow Elk Pass, Flint Spring, Keg Mountain, and were close to the crossword settlement of Joy. Joy was a combination post office, supply station, rooming house, and stage station operated by Aunt May and her husband, Mac Laird. George and I had planned to catch the herd and deliver the supplies. The bucks, 150 in number, were to be cut out of the herd, and Earl and I were to drive them back home to Draper with this outfit. The last camp we had made was at Flint Spring. I often thought that it was called that because of the extreme hardness of the water. It was nearly noon as we approached Aunt May's. About 100 yards from her shack, her big black and white dog came out to meet us with a tomato can in its mouth. We stopped the horses to give the dog a pat. George and his hand on the top of the standard of the bolster. When the horses started, the kingpin broke, letting the wagon and its load down on his hand, catching it between the standard and the projection. I got the wagon jack as quickly as I could and lifted the weight off his hand. The skin, though hard and dry, was broken in several places, but we guessed there were no broken bones. "I'll take care of that," said Aunt May, "but you'll stay close for a while so I can look after it again." She carefully cleaned and wrapped his hand. I've often wondered why the accident happened so close to these wonderful old people. The town of Joy dates back to 1872, when the Drum Mountain Mining District was formed and named after Henry Joy, a mining engineer. Earl and Eldon had left word with the Lairds that they were heading for the Sand Pass area. On Sand Pass, we picked up a notice that they were heading for the Convulsion Range. I think that is Convulsion Range. We were able to follow their tracks and soon spotted their camp on the eastern slope. We were all glad to meet again and got down to serious plans on how we were going to handle our big outfit. Earl asked George if he thought it was wise for him to stay out with his bad hand. George answered, as expected, that he thought it was going to be all right. I think he was looking forward to spending the rest of the winter in this area, which is known by sheepmen as the best winter range around. After what had happened to George, I knew I couldn't leave him 100 or so miles from home with his injury showing little improvement. After a while, I was able to push aside the disappointment of not being able to return home as planned. After hum-hawing for a little while, I finally said, "Tuck, I'm staying out, and that's final. Just leave me your extra clothes." By the way, George was at least 30 pounds heavier than I was. By the third morning after our arrival, we had cut the bucks out of the herd, and the supplies were divided, leaving as many as possible with Eldon and I. The first time I moved out of our camp after becoming camp mover, I was up a short, steep hill after crossing a wash when one of the horses balked. This caused the trail wagon to cramp back into the wash, breaking parts of the running gear. Well, my trail was my commissary wagon, so it could have been worse if the camp wagon was not movable. I managed to uncouple the wagons. The old horse that had caused the trouble seemed to be aware of what had caused, so he really buckled down to the job of helping pull the camp out of the wash. I loaded what supplies into the camp wagon and pressed on to catch Eldon with the herd. You can imagine Eldon's excitement when he saw me coming with only one wagon. 2 days later, a fellow by the name of Pete Jensen rode into the camp to see if we had any mail to go to the post office at Baker, Nevada. We invited him to eat with us, and while eating, we told him about our commissary wagon trouble. Pete suggested that he would be glad to do what he could to get some lumber for repairs. To keep sheep thriving, they have to keep slowly on the move toward the Conjure Range. Our outfit crossed the old Indian trail that runs from Death Canyon across Tooele Valley and west into Nevada. We crossed the old freight road, which was also come down Death Canyon, past Tooele Spring and west over Cowboy Pass. The snow was getting scarce, and the snow meant water for the sheep, which they should have about every other day. We did not want to get farther away from our commissary in the wash. We were nearing a place that Pete had told us about, so I climbed up on a horse and rode out to scout the country. I came upon a rather well-traveled road, so I followed it into the hills. I was looking for a place Pete had told us about called Skunk Spring. Pete had said that there was a man living there by the name of Bill Meekum. Bill's shack was of gray weathered lumber with a door on one end and a fireplace at the other with a small window on each side. A rather short and stocky fellow stood in the doorway watching me as I rode around the corner of a small pole corral. He grinned as he greeted me. "You must be the guy with the wagon in the wash." "Yup, you're right," I returned. "I'm Marv Stringfellow." "I'm Bill Meekin. I looked after this place for the Bakers." "You're kind of young compared to most of the fellows out here on the range." "That's your lumber for your busted wagon over there. I hope it'll come closest to fittin'." "How in the devil did you come to do this for me?" I said as I swung out of the saddle to examine the hardwood lying in the shade of the cabin. "Pete told over at the ranch what happened to you, so they got busy and sawed you some hounds and reaches, figuring they'd be big enough and you could trim 'em to fit." "I hope you got a saw and some bits and brace." "Yeah, I've got quite a few tools." "Boy, you don't know how much I appreciate this stuff being ready for me." We talked a while, then I began to feel that I had better be getting back to the herd and Eldon to deliver the good news. Bill had said that they had told him over at the ranch to go with me and held with the heavy work that was probably too much for one man. Since he was going to help, I thought we would pay him after we saw how much of his time he spent with us. As I rode away, I was still amazed at the interest this Baker outfit had taken with us as total strangers. Our camp was now less than a mile from Bill's cabin, and it was not yet daylight when I left Eldon doing the breakfast dishes. I was riding a big gray horse and leading a harnessed team as I approached the cabin. I noticed two strange saddle horses tied to the pole corral, and a dim light flickered in the small window. The cabin door swung open as a horse nickered my arrival. As I approached the door, we shook hands and Bill introduced me to the others, who he explained worked for another sheepman by the name of Tom Singleton. One glance told me that he had been having an all-night party. They offered me a drink, but I refused, trying to be polite, and covered the surge of anger that crept over me when I saw that Bill would not want to leave with these two hanging around. "You'll drink with us one of these days if you're going to follow this kind of life for long," one of them mumbled from the corner of the room. I turned and stepped out of the door, and Bill followed without saying anything, helped me tie the lumber on my horses. "How much do I owe you, Bill?" pulling a slip of paper out of his shirt pocket and handing it to him without unfolding it. It was a regular bill from their store in Baker for $5.50. I tried to act normal. I paid him and thanked him again. He followed me to one side and apologized. He could no doubt read some disgust and disappointment in my manner. "I don't know what you'd do, Marv," he said. "I can't leave this place while they're here. If they know I'm going with you, they could come back and ransack the place. I don't trust them in the shape they're in, and if the Bakers find I've not helped you, I could lose my job. I'll make it okay. Don't worry about me. I've got the whole day ahead of me, and don't forget, I appreciate what you've done already." So I took off down the slope and north towards the Confusion Range and my busted wagon. The sun had not yet made its appearance over the Sawtooth Range to the east. In the chill of the morning, I felt more like riding than walking, but I was in a hurry. As I rode along, I began to figure in my mind how I was going to maneuver the wagon around and drag it out of the wash in parts so I could work on it. It must have taken an hour or more to get back to the wagon, which I found just as I had left it, sitting on its back end in the wash. First I hitched the horse to the wagon box and pulled it free, then the front end, and then the back wheels. I began to rebuild and replace. About 3 p.m, I had it so much it would hold together while the team pulled it back to our camp in a little valley on the Conger. It had been dark about 2 hours when I crawled into the camp wagon to tie into a meal that Eldon had been holding for me on the back of the stove. This was the first time I thought about food all day. It was kind of a big day for a kid, I think, as I look back now, as it was 60 years ago. That was the last I saw of Bill Meekum for some 25 years. The next time we met was in the lobby of the Old Colon Hotel in Salt Lake City. A mutual friend nudged me and said, "That man over there, he knows you. How about it? Do you know him?" "That's got to be Bill Meekum. We had a big deal at Skunk Spring on Conjure Mountain quite some time ago." After a few minutes, we got together and had a great time bringing each other up to date on what had happened in our lives. I know I beamed and was embarrassed as Bill told our friend what a remarkable young punk I was out on the desert. "We better get ready for a big move," Eldon suggested. "We're running short of both feed and snow. Pull the camp over near Painter Spring tomorrow. Then maybe we'll be able to water there, and you can ride over to Margin Pass to check on feed." After loading the camp near Painter Spring, I rode up the canyon to see if the water was running, a stream that would be suitable for our big herd. About a mile above the valley floor, I found the small stream mostly ice and not very tempting, but the north faces of the hills and the north side of the huge granite boulders protected the snow from the sun, so I came back to Eldon with a favorable report. So we decided he could hold the herd there for a day while I rode on to check for more feed. The next morning, after the breakfast dishes were done, I saddled the big gray again. We called him Jimmy. I guess in all my life I can't remember a horse that topped old Jimmy. This big gray pacer could carry a man over a huge stretch of country in a day and act like he enjoyed it as much as the rider. Jimmy and I rode up Granite Canyon. I could see that we would have to go over the pass to find enough snow. We followed the wash up the canyon as it twisted and turned between great walls of gray and pink limestone. This has got to be one of the most beautiful places on the West Desert. When over the pass, the country opens up and slopes gently to the east for about 10 miles or more, and it appeared to me to be just what our big herd needed for the next couple of weeks. Swinging over a couple of ridges to the north, Jimmy and I found a nice sunny knoll where the view was good and the sun was warm, where we proceeded to relax with a lunch from my saddlebag and feed of oats that I had tied behind my saddle for Jimmy. I was fascinated by the apparent mineralization of the country and wished that I had more time to poke around a bit. This, I guess, is about the first time I had the desire to prospect. I promised myself that I'd take the time later to know the Antelope Hills better. As we turned to ride back toward the camp, my eyes were on the ground. I knew this range had what we needed for the sheep and would be interesting for me to live in for a week or so. As old Jimmy and I headed back over the pass and down the canyon, I couldn't help but notice the difference that afternoon made on the canyon walls. The colors were grayer and colder, and even the areas kissed by the afternoon sun seemed less warm than the morning sun. At the mouth of Granite Canyon, my attention was drawn to a camp wagon on the ridge about a half-mile to the northwest, so headed that direction, thinking it might be a good idea to find out whose outfit it was and how they were doing. Their sheep were not in sight. Before we got to the camp, we spotted the herder with his horse and 3 dogs, so we set our course in his direction. As we approached it, it looked like to me that he was working with a hammer and chisel on upended sandstone slab. "I'm Len Bailey, and this is the Rube Bailey outfit for Salt Lake. I'm Marv Stringfellow. My brothers and I have a herd over near Painter." I returned as I swung out of the saddle, and we shook hands. Len was an older than average sheep herder, his features accented by the red-brown color left by the months of exposure to the desert sun and the cold winter winds. His side of the conversation was punctuated by a hearty laugh. On the stone slab he had chiseled his name and was just finishing the date, February 10th, 1913. We visited for a short time and talked, as all sheep herders do, about the weather, the range conditions, and how the sheep are handling. "I'll likely see you again in a few days," I said as I climbed back on old Jimmy. I was hoping that he was not planning to move over to the Antelope Hills before we could get there. In recent years, I've been back to the area trying to find Len's marker, but without success. I'm sure the slab was not movable. When I reported to Eldon about the conditions I had found over on the Antelope Hills and my visit with Len Bailey, his only response was that he thought my visit was a mistake and that they would beat us to the feed over there. I've been thinking about that as I rode back. Even though we didn't talk about that area, he still might be planning that move. I'll have the wagons rolling an hour before daylight. That should get us up to the Margin Road before they can get from where they are camped to the road. I'll be heading up the canyon where we can noon at the little spring at the fork about a mile up Granite Canyon. I doubt if the sheep can move that far in that length of time, but we'll be in the canyon ahead of time. Maybe they'll move north to Swayze, and we're concerned for nothing, Eldon suggested. We rolled out of bed early, and after a quick breakfast of sourdough hot cakes, I got the wagons ready to move before the sheep were in a mood to move off to the bed ground. I was moving up the road toward Granite Canyon before there was any sign of life at the Bailey camp. The herd was not yet in sight off to the south, so I let the team take it easy, pulling up the slope. In fact, I stopped a couple of times to let them rest. We decided not to try to get together for a noon lunch. Winter days are short, and when you're busy moving, it's too much to bother to get everything out that's needed for a meal. Since we had breakfast early, I made sure that I had a sourdough biscuit in my coat pocket. I noticed, as I followed the winding road up Granite Canyon, that some unfortunate soul must have had a runaway down the canyon, as some broken wagon parts were widely scattered along the road. I never did hear whose outfit it was. Eldon and his oversized herd caught up with me just before dark. I had snow melted for the horses and the potatoes in the oven. The next day was mild and windy. A storm threatened. We agreed that if we made one more pull to the north, we would be in good shape, and I could take the commissary wagon into Deseret for 35 miles away for supplies. This could take 4 or 5 days. Conditions had to be good for the sheep because the camp couldn't be moved while I was gone. We decided that one more move was necessary to give the herd extra room in case the Bailey outfit should show up behind us. Pulling my outfit from one ridge to another, I would stop on the high spots to study and lay of the land, watching for a good campground and bed ground for the sheep. There was no sign of a road. Roads were scarce in those days. Stopping my outfit as a watch that looked uncertain to cross, I sat there in the spring seat, taking in the view of the country. Sometimes I'd like to take the time to study the mineralization in these hills, I said to myself. As I wrapped the lines around the brake and swung myself around, placing my feet on top of the front wheel, preparing to jump the ground. When my eyes hit the ground where I was to jump, there was a hole with a rusty color in the bottom. Second thought came to me that it was a rusty can, so I dropped to the ground with the hole between my feet. It was so unusual that I began to dig with my hands and kicking the dirt and gravel away with my shoes. I tugged at the rock and found that it was twice as heavy as I expected. This was somehow different than any rock I had seen, and wondered if it could be valuable. Surely it must be. How did it get where it was? It must have weighed 30 pounds or more. Was it horn silver? I scanned the country for a ledge of similar material. There was 3 or 4 pieces of ordinary rock about the size of an egg embedded in the rest, and it looked to my untrained eye like pure metal. I put the piece of float in the jockey box and went on my way. Eldon came from herding about noon. When I showed him my rock, he got a hammer and began to work on it while I was getting lunch for us. With the commissary wagon unloaded and greased the day before, I was able to get an early start for Deseret for supplies. The weather was still mild and windy, and we thought it threatened to storm. I was anxious to make the trip in 3 days if possible. The house range slopes down gently to the east, so I made good time as far as Freighter's Well. As I rounded the bend in the road leading into Freighter's Well Cove, I noticed an outfit hitching up. It looked like they had spent the night at the well. "Hi, Marv," Len bellowed. "You going clear into town? You must have got up before breakfast." Len Bailey would be good company. He was glad to move along with him. I was glad to move along with him, however. He didn't seem to be in as big a hurry as I was. I didn't let that slow me down any. He followed close enough so that we could yell at each other once in a while. It was raining lightly when we got to Deseret. It rained most of the next day as we hustled about loading our supplies. At the edge of the town, going west, we ran into some wet and slick road which gave us a taste of serious trouble. The heavy loaded wagons cut deep into the gumbo, which also clung to the hooves of the horses and seemed to irritate and tire them. Later in the morning, Len's team began to show signs of weakening. We knew we couldn't stop, and the mud would be even worse off the road. My team got quite a lead on Len's. I took my team off my wagon, shouldered the double tree, and sloshed my way behind my horses to hook onto the end of his wagon tongue, and pulled his outfit up to my wagon. We repeated this method several times until we crossed the Greasewood Flat. We stopped for the night where Swayze washed, crossed the road, glad to be in the gravel country where we could start a fire, feed the horses, and find a snack for ourselves. It's a long night rolled up in quilts by a fire. The rain had stopped and the temperature was dropping. We could see that Len's team could make it fine now, and we agreed that I would go ahead and he would follow at his own speed. My team covered the remaining 20 miles the second day out of Deseret, and I arrived at our camp about 10 o'clock that night. In the mail that was waiting for us at Deseret, we got word that George and Earl would be out to join us about the 15th of March to split the herd. I had my instructions to find a corral where the split could be accomplished, so I began to inquire among the neighboring herds, and I rode to Antelope Spring to look around. In my travels, I met Sam Neff, who mentioned that the only corral he knew of was at Swayze Spring. We pulled the outfit several miles to the north so that I could make the ride the rest of the way to Swayze Spring and back in one day. I found the corral could be used with a few repairs. Knowing this, we could relax for a while waiting for the arrival of our brothers. The morning was bright and clear, and we had a light snow show up during the night, so we agreed that I should saddle up old Jimmy and ride to Joy to leave word for George and Earl where they could find us. As I climbed onto my horse that beautiful morning, I rode with a whistle and a song in my heart. I soon found myself waiting for a rider coming toward me from the south. The rider turned out to be my new friend Sam Neff. He was on his way to a herd in the Swayze Knolls, and when he found out I was headed for Joy, he decided it was not far out of his way, so he would ride with me. It was late afternoon when Sam and I tromped across the wood porch and swung open the door to the hotel. Cafe, post office arrangement. Everyone in the sight was under the influence of the noted moonshine liquor. Some had passed out completely in various grotesque positions on the floor. As it turned out, the only sober persons were a young mother by the name of Mrs. Bliss and her 2 children. Mr. Bliss had passed out and had been rolling into a small dugout adjoining the larger room. Aunt May was drunk, but was still mobile when she strode into the room and greeted us. She called me to her and told me she told me where I could find the mail that was waiting for me. Sam and I found our way through the drunken mess and seated ourselves at a small table that had the only lamp in the room on it. We were reading our mail and trying to keep our minds on our business when a half-made nut by the name of Rhodes came over to our table and wanted us to share his bottle with him. Sam was the first to reply to him, saying he never drank the stuff. Then Rhodes looked me over and said, "What about you, kid?" That remark and the looks of him made me cut loose with, "I never use the stuff, and besides, I've got mail to read and letters to write so I can leave early in the morning." At first, Rhodes seemed to take my remarks rather well, better than I expected, but in a few minutes he was back after me again. He didn't appear to want to bother Sam. He was after me only, I could plainly see. I turned him down again, and he turned from me loudly swearing and threatening. Sam nudged me with his elbow and quietly said, "Don't let him scare you. You probably don't have to drink with him if you don't want to. He's probably picking on you 'cause you're young and he likes to hear the men laugh at him. I'll back you up if he starts anything serious." "Don't let him hit you with that bottle he's swinging around," Sam added. The next trip back to our table, I could feel my anger flush my face, and I said, "I'm not drinking with you, and let this be the last time you bother me about it." He left the room mumbling something about going out to his horse to get something. "And then I'll bet you wish you had a drink with me," he said as his words followed him out the door and across the porch. How did he ever pick this kind of time to come to Joy? How did we ever pick this time to come to Joy? I muttered to Sam over my shoulder. One of the onlookers by the name of Adamson volunteered his advice to me with, "You better drink with him, young feller, or he'll not leave you alone all night." Without looking up, I gave him his answer. "If he's a friend of yours and you think anything of him, you better take care of him. I won't be bothered any more," I added as an afterthought. I think he can take care of himself all right, returned Adamson as he changed his position in an old hardwood chair. Sam shot him a straight look and followed with, "He'll never get to Marv, you can bet on that." Rhodes came back through the door, and I couldn't see anything he had gone after, so I pretended not to notice as I got to my feet. He pushed something into my middle and said, "Now you'll be sociable and drink with me like a man." It startled me, and I still wasn't sure what he was pushing at me, but it got a big laugh from others who were awake. Not waiting for the laughing to quiet down, I called him a string of names that didn't sit well with him. He made a move to cuff me, so I let him have a hard right, which landed him right on his chin. When the blinding anger that flashed before my eyes cleared, Rhodes was piled in the corner, and I was right on top of him. Sam was pulling at my arm, trying to get me back to the table. "You've done a good job, Marv. Now let him be. He's not going nowhere." Adamson broke in with, "He'll not bother you no more tonight." We managed to get a bed set up in the hallway. As we were getting settled, I noticed my left hand bothered me. I told Sam, "I can't figure it. I remember hitting him with my right, but I've hurt my left one." "Yes, you hit him with your right first, but on his way to the corner, you hit him at least twice more. Kinda hard to see in that light. You'll realize why your hand hurts if you go in and look at his face." As I walked in to have a look, I realized there was the most contemptible man I had ever met. He was a hard looker, all right. "You take that inside of the bed next to the wall," suggested Sam. "Can't tell he might come looking for you, and we wouldn't want him to get a jump on you since he's heavier than you. If he does show up in the fighting mood, I'll back him off with this." Sam pulled out a .44 revolver from under his coat. "You know, Marv, I've never come so close to using it on a man in my life as I did tonight. If he got a hold of you first, I believe I'd use it, but he got what he had coming from you." The mental suffering that I experienced following the way this punk worked on me before the bunch at Aunt May's was the worst of its kind that I had experienced before or since in my life. I had always enjoyed making friends wherever I went, but I had failed in this affair, and it hurt my pride immensely for a week or two. George and Earl came by Joy a few days later and got the story firsthand from Aunt May. On the road from Joy to Swayze Spring, they met Rhodes, who attempted to explain to them the event in a light that relieved him of some of the blame. My brother told me that he couldn't have been nicer when he talked to them. Worst of all, they suggested that it wouldn't have hurt me to have had a drink with him. With disgust, I turned away, saying, "Yeah, maybe sober I could stand him, but drunk he was repulsive, and that's that, so forget it." Eldon took my side, and that helped a lot. Eldon was the shortest of the four of us, but he made up for it. Like lots of smaller men, would fight at the drop of a hat. The fact that Eldon had served a 2-year mission for the Mormon Church in the Midwest had shaped his outlook on liquor. The Stringfellow outfit split their herd at Swayze Spring a few days after the brothers showed up. Eldon, George, and I took the bigger herd with the plan to start for the South Hills, south of Draper, where we were scheduled to begin lambing on April 12th. Earl was to wait the arrival of Gerald Terry to move camp for him to his lambing ground. We crossed the valley to the east to the Little Drum Mountain. The feed was good, and there was still some snow on the north slope, so we slowed to a stop for the benefit of the sheep. George came into camp at night, complaining that he felt punk. He didn't want anything to eat, and after washing his face and hands, he crawled right into bed. He seemed to have a high fever, and towards morning began to rant and rave, and talked in his sleep. Next morning, I arranged to melt a couple of tubs of snow for the horses. I climbed aboard old Jimmy and headed for Joy, about 5 miles away. My thinking was that maybe I could arrange to have some medicine brought in on the stage for George. Aunt May and Mac suggested that there would be nothing better for him than alcohol toddies and some soup if he could get him to take it. As it turned out, we got the white mule toddies down him, but it was hard, for a couple of days, to get to take orders. He was a sight to behold, with his weak old beard studded with sores, and his usual desert tan faded to almost white. After 4 days holding up the herd for George's sake, we began to consider what could be done toward getting him to a doctor or sending him home. The stage went from Joy to Deseret and back twice a week, but we suggested he catch it. But he would have no part of it. We couldn't blame him because of the way he looked, to say nothing of the way he felt. A herd of sheep heavy with wool and heavy with lamb, and 100 miles from its lambing ground with a predetermined date to start lambing, had to get moving or know some way to make up for lost time. Eventually George realized how further delay on his account would be rough on the herd, so he agreed to take the stage to Deseret and catch a train for Draper. Arrangements were made for the stage driver to be on the lookout for him on the road south of Joy. I got him down the slope to the road early, and I'll always remember the sight. "Now you better get the hell back to your outfit, or you'll never catch Eldon with the sheep," he bellowed as he hung onto a juniper limb above his head, heaving, or trying to. "I'll be all right now. Get back to camp," he continued. Choked up, as I wish I could only force out 2 words. "Good luck," gave him a hug, and crawled on old Jimmy and rode back to camp to get things moving. About an hour passed getting the camp outfit together, packed and the horses harnessed and ready to move on. I pulled in the direction of the stage road where I had left George. The tracks by the roadside didn't tell me much, but I decided he must have got on his way, so I headed up the road toward Joy, feeling somewhat relieved that we had done the best we could under the circumstances. It was close to noon when I rounded the bend below Joy. There stood Aunt May in the middle of the road. She was probably anxious to hear how George is doing, I thought as I approached. "I'm glad to see that George is feeling better," she said, to my amazement. "What do you mean?" I returned. "When I left him to catch the stage, a tree was holding him up, and he appeared to be as sick as ever. I've got his horse, and he's walking." "But he was following behind the herd this morning." "Are you sure?" "That damned fool brother of mine will never get himself better if he doesn't get to that doctor." Aunt May returned with, "But he told me that he felt much better, and for the first time he felt like he was going to be all right." While loading up with water and groceries, I met an old friend from Draper by the name of Lloyd Lee. So we could have some time to visit, he agreed to ride down to the herd with me and have a late lunch with us. Down to the road, we picked up George. He crawled into the camp and onto the bunk. We caught up with Eldon and the sheep and got dinner ready. After the meal, Lloyd dried the dishes for me. We said goodbye, and he climbed on his buckskin mare and headed back toward Joy, and I headed my outfit toward Picture Rock Reservoir. George stayed in bed the rest of the day, and I didn't hear a peep out of him. The ride that afternoon gave me time to reflect on the events of the morning. How miserable George must have felt facing the long rides on the stage and train. How mean he was with me at our parting. How discouraged I felt as I rode back to camp with a prayer in my heart as I rode that he would be How mean he was with me at our parting. How discouraged I felt as I rode back to camp with a prayer in my heart that he would be relieved of his suffering, and he soon would be his old self again and be able to help us. With lambing only a few weeks away, we would need all the good help we could get, to say nothing of the long days on the trail, the night herding, to keep the sheep from mixing with other herds also on the trail. After what had happened today, I had faith that right had prevailed and George would soon be helping us with our herd. We pulled into Picture Rock. Another herd had just finished watering, and the water was muddy, so we didn't get a good watering. So we hit the trail again, resting up again on the south end of the Keg Mountain. George was spending more time out of bed now and was kicking around a bit. He said he felt much better, but he sure didn't look it. He was really a hard-looking customer. When he said he was hungry, that was the best word I got from him in many days. We watered at Riverbed and the 6 Mile Reservoir on following days. While I was getting dinner ready at 6 Mile, a fellow by the name of Cummings and a friend stopped to find out whose outfit we were and to say hello. Cummings' friend stuck his head in the door of the camp wagon and asked if he had a gun handy. He said he could see a coyote. Being busy, I pointed to the .30-30 laying on the bed. In his hurried grab for it, it went off, shooting under the bed and out the back of the camp, between the front legs of Cummings' horse. The horse jumped and reared, throwing Cummings to the ground. It gave us all a right good scare. Cummings said he was all right as he beat the dust out of his clothes. We invited them to share dinner with us. Strange, whenever you visit a sheep camp, you are always invited to eat with them. We tried to water the sheep every 3 days if we could. The weather was getting warmer and the days were getting longer. A sheep herder will always tell you that his longest days of the year are in April. After watering at Simpson Springs, we pulled north, the Simpson Point, where we had night herd all night. After this watering, the sheep were hungry and wouldn't settle down, and with other herds close, we could not risk a mix. We had no time for that. Eldon and George made the sheep rest up on Government Wash so we could water earlier in the day the next day. We watered at the James Ranch on Government Creek, then pulled to the north toward Lookout Pass before stopping. Our next stops were the Crow Ranch and the Foust Creek, and when we were well into Rush Valley, I made a long pull with the camp in preparation to making a ride to the Fairfield Shearing Corral. We needed to know about our shearing date. As I was preparing to leave, I spotted a rider heading our way. The news he brought was that they could start shearing us the day after tomorrow. This was a lucky break for us. We pulled to the corral early in the morning, and it took till about 3 in the afternoon the next day to finish us up. No time was lost. We knew that it was a big 3 days to get to our lambing ground. The second day out of the shearing corral, we stopped the herd for a rest just west of Lehigh, and about a dozen lambs were born. When the herd pulled away, we put the ewes and their lambs in a nearby field. The following day, after a long pull, we found ourselves moving on to the lambing ground. The next morning, George and I took a wagon and went back for the ewes and lambs. One more day on the trail, and we would have been in real trouble. They gave me the job of herding the dropping band, from which the ewes that lamb are carefully cut out of the herd 2 or 3 times a day, so every day the dropping band gets a little smaller. This was a great job after the long days on the trail. About 5 weeks found the herd heading for the June Range near Wallsburg, and yours truly to his old spot at shortstop on the Draper baseball team. The end. Thank you for listening.